Hello and welcome to the fourth and last of a series of webinars about CRISPR-Cas. That is a very special tool for biologists that has been discovered only some 8-9 years ago and has in this short time revolutionized the way life scientists work. These webinars are organized by the Forum for Genetic Research from the Swiss Academy of Sciences, and they are co-sponsored by the Federal Office for the Environment. I am Thomas Häusler, a science reporter with Swiss Public Radio SRF, and I am moderating this event. In today's seminar, we will look at CRISPR and society. We will discuss how our society deals with new technologies, taking CRISPR as an example. More in detail, we will look at two tools that are used to gauge the effects of a new technology with unknown aspects We are looking at two tools that are used to gauge the effects of a new technology with unknown aspects might have in different areas of our life, on daily life, on the economy, on nature. These two tools are called technology impact assessments and the precautionary principle. We will in turn also look at how these tools impact the use of the new technology assessed, in our case, CRISPR. There will be two presentations and afterwards a Q&A session. As usual, as this webinar is not really a good format to have a full-blown debate, we ask you to stick to questions rather than stating opinions. Feel free to write your questions already during the presentations in the Q&A box. If there are questions of understanding, we will take up those directly after each talk. The other questions will be answered in the Q&A session after the second talk. Our first speaker is Harald König. He is senior researcher at the Institute for Technology Assessment and Systems Analysis in Karlsruhe. He will talk about what technology impact assessments can contribute to how the use of CRISPR is regulated. Please, Harald.
Yeah, thank you very much, Thomas, for this nice introduction. And I try to share the screen, just a second. I hope this will work. Yes, and thanks also to the organizers here. It's my real pleasure to share and discuss with you some thoughts and experiences today. And as you know, CRISPR has contributed to various areas and may in fact change present application as well as new ones. And as Thomas already said, we heard about some of these areas and application in the previous webinars, in particular related to basic research, to gene therapies and crop breeding. But I would briefly mention that there are also some other important areas of CRISPR application, like gene drives that can rapidly spread genetic modifications to suppress or modify wild populations, and could be used, for instance, to fight malaria-transmitting mosquitoes or to control invasive species. Another area, important area, is metabolic engineering to design a new production strains, for instance, or yeast for industrial biotechnology. Now, we also heard about and discussed various aspects of CRISPR applications, ranging from benefits and risks to regulatory and ethical issues, or to questions of societal acceptance. And all these points do actually relate to today's topic, namely of how we as a society could or should further develop, use, and actually govern CRISPR for such applications. Now, these points and discussions actually touch different dimensions that may need to play a role when it comes to the questions of how we or societies may use and govern such technologies in a responsible manner. I think the first of those dimensions is knowledge and uncertainties. For instance, what do or can we know about how a technology may contribute to solve a challenge? Or what could be possible risks or negative impacts, and importantly, for whom? A second dimension are morals and values. So it is right. Is it morally right to use such a technology for a specific application? If we think to, for instance, alter the human genome or to tinker with nature, are such a moral stances people could have. And then there is the dimension of the governance with questions such as who decides on what, how are responsibilities distributed, or how are uncertainties dealt with and how are they communicated. And related to this is also the question of how precautionary approaches look like. And I guess we'll about this in the second talk, and or how are conflicts of interest or values dealt with. Now, what I would like to do in the following is to share some thoughts and also experience from our work on how we may get answers and what type of answers this might be. I would like to look in particular on the role of science and to some extent overlapping with this, what we call technology assessment. Now, what is technology assessment? Actually, the term was first used in the 1960s, mainly in the US, when Congress called for better information and advice to evaluate governmental decisions or to choose and implement R&D policies. And there what they thought technology assessment should be is the evaluation of the impact of technologies upon societies to give them a sort of mechanism for anticipating short and long range potentials of those technologies for the good or for the bad. And in 1972, there was a first Office for Technology Assessment implemented at the Congress and was later then dismantled. And today there is still a TA unit at the US Government Accountability Office at the Congress. Now, at the time, there are various TA institutions across the world, but mainly in Europe. For instance, in Switzerland, you may know this is TA Swiss, which is an independent foundation which advises the parliament, for instance. In Germany, it's for instance the Office for Technology Assessment at the Bundestag. There are such institutions at the European Parliament. And there exist various forms of concepts of TA so far, ranging from more expert-driven approaches to more participatory approaches. Now, we at ITAS, for instance, we do both research and are also involved in policy advice. And on the research side, of course, we study the impacts of new scientific and technological developments, but also the complex interrelations between science, technology, and society. And we do this actually in an inter- and transdisciplinary manner. That means we are also involving non-scientific actors and stakeholders or citizens. And this type of research actually aims to provide knowledge for actions, that is to say, knowledge which is relevant for societal challenges in practice. And such knowledge then, of course, should be also useful for our second task, which is policy advice. As I said, for instance, for the German Parliament via the Office of Technology Assessment there. Now, this orientation of knowledge towards solving societal challenges on the one hand, and the involvement of different disciplines and actors are related and contribute to the conception of so-called responsible research innovation, which I would also briefly introduce here, because this responsible research and innovation, or RRI, actually has played an increasing role for EU policy. And actually, it tries to better align science and innovation to societal needs and ethical acceptability. And the key element there is to early involve and communicate with all stakeholders and the public, which should allow, for instance, to identify potential impacts early on, but also generate trust in regulations. And an important element is also that stakeholders should actually become co-responsible by constructive input. So to speak, by co-constructing technologies. Now, to get an idea about the role science and TA and RRI may play to address the dimensions and the questions I pointed out at the beginning, I would like to join me to first look in somewhat more detail on typical issues and steps to assess technologies. So there are first, of course, experimental data, for instance, on health or physiological effects. And they may come from feeding studies, for instance, or if you think on GMO crops, or looking at differences in plant compounds. Similarly, such data, scientific data, can be generated on environmental effects like greenhouse gas emissions, for instance, by sort of life cycle assessments. Now, of course, then the next question would be, what is actually the biological relevance of those data? For instance, what do differences in amounts of some plant components or cell components actually mean with respect to health effects or potential dangers to the environment? Another question needs to be answered are, what are social or economic effects? For instance, effects on livelihoods of farmers in the global south with respect to certain technologies. And then there is, of course, the already mentioned dimension of moral ethical issues, such as naturalness related to GMO food, which was already discussed in previous seminars, or if you think of those slippery slopes toward genetic enhancement, if you think, for instance, of germline therapies via CRISPR. And finally, of course, there's the issue of appropriate or acceptable policy measures. And I do not want to simplify too much, but what I would like to point out is that from top to bottom of those points, I think what I can say is that the background and influence of values and worldviews gets more important. This is to say, data and outcomes are increasingly interpreted and judged against the background of different worldviews and or values of different actors. Conversely, I would say, and this is linked to this, purely scientific objective data become or may be seen by some actors as less relevant if you go from top to down here. And what one maybe could say is that TA and RRI, with their interdisciplinary and inclusive approaches, what they try is to address and take these points, all these points and issues into account that pure science and pure scientific data can less and less address if you go from top to down here. So, however, I don't want to leave you with the impression that TA, RRI, and in particular those inclusive deliberation approaches may solve all this. They also have their limits. And I would like to explain this with an example and our experience from a large international project on RRI. And this example is about synthetic biology with genome editing to design microbial strains to produce, for instance, plant products such as flavors or fragrances, or sort of green chemicals and biofuels. And there we experienced that dialogue activities, they revealed sharp divides on synthetic biology and genome editing and their role to realize even common goals such as sustainability. And actually, there were two sides which then collide. On the one hand, there's technology-driven efficiency increase and economic growth, and on the other side, people propose that those more biomass use or those new technology lead to more biomass use or commodification of nature, and the solution should be rather demand restrained. And this, just to make this a little bit more clear, just a concrete examples, if you, for instance, on the one hand, people like policymakers and people from industry, they say those new biotechnology techniques, they lead to more efficient biomass use and entail less land use or lower carbon footprint, and others, for instance, civil society organizations, they say those technologies, they accelerate and increase overall biomass use. lead to more greenhouse gas emissions. And more importantly, they also bring into play social and socio-economic impacts, such as negative effects on livelihoods of farmers in the global south. It's just to give you a concrete examples. And actually, those divides which you can find there, they appear to be linked to deep value differences and actually competing worldviews, and may thus unlikely to be overcome. And this, in my view, calls already into questions those RRI notions of truly co-constructing those technologies in an inclusive manner. Of course, then you could ask what actually inclusive or participatory approaches in TA or RRI, what they can contribute. And in our experience, one thing is that dialogue and participation, they are no consensus machine, and maybe they shouldn't be. But they could help to find common ground and identify differences in expectations and worldviews, such as what is the challenge or what is at stake and for whom. They could avoid a restricted view to use of a specific technology, and they could shed light on where and how a specific technology could contribute and may be acceptable to different peoples in order to solve a specific challenge. And maybe at the end, I think this constructive input which RRI and those participatory approaches dream of, maybe to inform then meaningful governance and policies rather than directly co-construct technologies. And I think what meaningful could be is that those approaches are open to develop various solutions. That technology can be used differently or an alternative in different places. All those processes, they should be transparent with respect to uncertainty, scientific results, potential conflicts of interest, and they should be, last but not least, open to inclusive review and revision. These are the experiences we got from when we looked at how those technologies interact with society, so to speak. And at the end, I would like to thank you for your attention, of course.
Thank you very much, Harald, for an insightful talk. There is now possibility for questions of understanding, if there are any. And of course, you can already write other questions, as has happened already in the Q&A for after the second talk. Are there any questions about issues of understanding for this talk? It doesn't seem to be the case. Then we'll go to the second speaker for the second talk with Monika Betzler. She holds the chair for practical philosophy and ethics at the Ludwig-Maximilian University, Munich. She's also director of the Munich Center of Ethics and member of the Swiss Federal Ethics Committee on Non-Human Biotechnology. In her talk, Monika Betzler will explain the precautionary principle, and she will discuss how it is used in regulating new technologies like CRISPR. Please, Monika.
So let me share my screen. Can you see it? Seems like it.
Yes.
You can. Okay. So thanks for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here. Before I get started, I should emphasize I'm speaking here as an ethicist and not as a scientist. And I'm also speaking as a member of the Swiss Federal Ethics Committee on Non-Human Biotechnology. But I should clarify, I do not represent the entire committee. I just speak as one voice among many. Of course, we also have scientists being members on our committee who inform us about the latest developments in biotechnologies, which I'm, as an ethicist, unable to do. So I guess two sides always have to play together. And if I may comment on the title of this webinar, CRISPR in Society, I guess I represent the society part. Let me get started. So biotechnology and CRISPR in particular often interferes with processes not fully understood. Biotechnology involves interaction with natural systems, understood only partially, or permits only partial control of what outcomes result from such interaction. And Harald König already referred to that. So the main question we posed ourselves in the ethics committee, given that starting point and the latest development in these biotechnologies, is how cautious should one be in introducing and using new biotechnological application? That's a question that's of eminent importance for policymakers and calls for an ethics of responsible handling of risks and uncertainties. So the big question in light of these latest developments is how we can assess what is good or right to do from an impartial moral point of view, given that we do have knowledge gaps and uncertainties regarding the dangerous effects of these technologies. So, so more precisely, new biotechnologies such as CRISPR-Cas highlight our ignorance in terms of holistic understanding of the overall potential effects due to incomplete understanding of widespread interactions within and between complex natural and human social systems. They have the potential for effects to affect more types of physical systems. There's an increased difficulty and cost of constructing and managing effective physical barriers to isolate effects from surrounding complex natural systems. And that's further complicated by the fact that affected changes of organisms are passed on and spread through reproductive mechanisms. So there's a lot going on, and there are lots of sort of risky effects produced by these new biotechnologies. Now, given the substantive potential harms combined with considerable knowledge gaps, motivates ethicists and policymakers to resort what legal theorists call the precautionary principle, or as I call it, the principle of precaution. Now, its theoretical motivation and background is the following. Excuse me. It may be justified to take political action in order to avoid dangers, also in lack of scientific proof. That means even if we do not know yet how grave and what exactly these dangers are, it might be justified to take political action to avoid these dangers, even though we don't have a precise handle on these dangers. That's one background condition. And such actions, namely to avoid these dangers, are indeed or seem to be justified if certain conditions are fulfilled. That is, especially if there is some considerable probability that such dangers are real. Therefore, we have a moral duty to avoid exposing people to such risks. Otherwise, we would be reckless. And many ethicists believe that this can be outweighed by potential benefits. And when exposing others to risk is an unavoidable possibility, we should base our decisions on what risks to expose others to, on sufficiently good information about risks and benefits. Otherwise, we're negligent. And given that we have knowledge gaps regarding those new technologies, as of now, we would be negligent if we did expose others to those risks involved in these new technologies. And that historically, the principle of precaution is a legal principle that has been implemented in environmental law. It was first made mention in 1992 in the so-called Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, and the European Union took it on board in its legal documents in a slightly different formulation in the year 2000, and also Swiss legal documents refer to the precautionary principle. Now, if we take a look at the Rio Declaration in Principle 15, it makes mention of the precautionary approach and states the following: in order to protect the environment, the precautionary approach shall be widely applied by states according to their capabilities. Now here it comes. Where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. What does that mean? We should not just wait and see until we know more, but actually we should use cost-effective measures now to prevent environmental degradation. So to prevent severe harm on the environment. So despite different formulations of that precautionary principle in different legal documents, there is a common core capturing this precautionary principle, which also plays a substantive role for our considerations. And here it is. We should take measures to prevent harm. First, if a certain degree of harm is to be expected, and particularly if it's serious and or irreversible, such as it is the case with CRISPR and the new biotechnologies, and scientific knowledge about the likelihood of the harm is to be expected is limited. So that's these are really two very, very important conditions, because many people misunderstand the principle of precaution. The principle of precaution is not about assessing risks. It's not about weighing harm and benefits, because it assumes that these harms and benefits are not yet fully known given our knowledge gaps. So it is a principle pertaining to situations where we only have sort of a dim sense that it could be pretty harmful, that some harm is to be expected, and that we have limited knowledge about the probabilities of this harm. So these are the two conditions that are really important. Otherwise, the principle of precaution doesn't hold. So this is when the principle of precaution applies. It applies when we don't know the precise risks involved. So to further clarify, we should think about what harm is. Harm is an outcome that's negatively evaluated, or to put it more bluntly, that's bad. And what is bad depends on what the entity is for which an outcome is bad. So harm for whom? Harm is morally relevant if it affects entities that have moral status. So different ethical theories think different entities have that moral status. We don't take a stand on that, but what could say only an anthropocentric view would hold only human beings have moral status. A pathocentric view would claim only that all sentient beings have moral status. That means beings who can suffer harm, or an even more encompassing view, the biocentric approach, would hold that all entities that live but might not be sensible or sentient have moral status, or even an ecocentric view, which holds that something is harmful if it affects nature at large. So as I say, we remain neutral with regard to these approaches, but the ecocentric one is certainly the most comprehensive one. The assumption is that in light of our knowledge gaps and the likelihood of harmful outcomes, we have a moral duty to take measures against possible harm, even if we have little knowledge about the probability of this harm actually occurring. That is, this is what we as policymakers and governments and as an international community owe to our citizens who will be affected by those biotechnologies. We can, if you like, distinguish between two different kinds of scenarios. One is we know about different harmful scenarios, but we're not sure how to evaluate the probability of their happening. In such cases, we have incomplete knowledge about the risks involved. And in the second scenario, we have plausible indications for harm ensuing, but we're unable to estimate the probability of its happening. And that's a case of uncertainty. And these are the only two cases where the principle of precaution applies, namely the case where we have incomplete knowledge about the risks involved. We're not sure how to evaluate the probability of harms happening, or it's a case of uncertainty where we are unable to estimate the probability of its happening, even though we have some indication that it might happen. So, of course, there are critics of the precautionary principle who point to the price of precaution. So they claim that whatever measures are taken to mitigate possible risks or collect better information will require resources that could have been spent on securing more certain benefits instead. They claim that whatever these measures are, they may also bring their own risks and immediate downsides. Or while we contemplate whether or not some action is too risky, or while we collect more information to make a responsible decision, we abstain from the possible benefits that the new technology might bring. More precisely, implementing the precautionary principle will conflict with our right to freedom of science or conflict with the right to free market activities. But this is what critics claim, often resorting to the so-called principle of innovation. But as the Federal Ethics Committee on Non-Human Biotechnology has shown in a working paper on does the principle of precaution need to be complemented by a principle of innovation, the principle, we should really bear in mind that the principle of precaution applies only in cases where serious harm is possible. So we have some indication, maybe some basic knowledge that harm is possible, yet the likelihood of harm occurring is as of yet difficult to assess. So as a result, we cannot assess the likelihood of harms and benefits, and we cannot say, the principle of precaution is bad because we should invest more in looking into the benefits. As of yet, we don't know how these two compare. And that's why the principle of precaution cannot be said to be against innovation, which would capture the benefits, given that we don't even know how to assess the probabilities regarding harms and benefits. So a lot of the skepticism is based on a misunderstanding of the principle of precaution. Now, let me just go quickly over requirements for sound ethics of risk and precaution. So the price of precaution must not be arbitrary. Equal cases need to be treated equally. It shouldn't be non-paradoxical. So the principle must be formulated in such a way that it can indeed provide ethical guidance, and it should be proportional. Some think that the mere presence of risk or lack of knowledge does not by itself justify precaution. The price of precaution cannot be infinitely large. So to take measures against possible and serious harm in light of the fact that it's epistemically uncertain whether such harm occurs is a moral duty if those harms affect third parties. That means us all as citizens. So some think that those who regard serious harms as probable need to provide arguments that their view is plausible. I think the option 2 is the better one, namely that those whose action is likely to bring about harm need to plausibly show that such harm is extremely unlikely or absurd. And I think option 2 is the better one because it falls on those who actually bring about those risks, who have to demonstrate that the risk isn't large enough or can be estimated, so that the principle of precaution does not apply. So there are various measures we can take in light of the principle of precaution. We can preview the knowledge gaps, risks, and chances, and potentially come to the conclusion that that we have a case where the principle of precaution applies, namely we have indication for dangers and harm, but we don't know how to assess the probabilities. Then we can choose between moratoria, namely temporary limited simple bans for technological applications, and simple bans, namely unlimited bans for entire classes of technological applications. Moratoria can be used to just gain more knowledge about the probabilities of harm occurring. Now, there are various ways, various ethical theories to evaluate harms. But so there's, on the one hand, one important ethical family of theories is deontology, going back to Immanuel Kant. And on the other hand, consequentialism, going back to the classical utilitarianists in the 19th century. But what is interesting in the case of precaution, and I don't want to take up too much time, so I sort of skip over this, because what's interesting about these various ethical theories is that they actually converge when it comes to cases of precaution, because given that we can't assess properly the risks and chances, and we're unable to compare them, so we can't provide a cost-benefit analysis as consequentialists would like to have it. So they actually come to a very similar conclusion as do deontologists, namely, if we don't know how big the harm is and how likely it is, our negative duty to prevent harm is weightier than our positive duty to provide benefits. So we should take harm more seriously in such cases than potential benefits if the likelihood of harm is there, but it's too complex and as of yet unknown how to assess the probability of that harm. So let me come to my concluding remarks. As we all know, new biotechnologies develop rapidly and offer great potential. As of yet, it remains unclear to what extent that potential can be realized. These new biotechnologies confront us with substantial uncertainties, knowledge gaps about their functioning and their effects on other organisms, increased probability of harm if technologically altered organisms interact with our environment. We all, scientists and governments alike, have a moral duty of precaution to prevent those harms if it is scientifically plausible to assume that they might occur, but we do not yet know to what exact likelihood they will occur. In such cases, the principle of precaution, as we think is plausible to assume, applies. Thank you very much for your attention and your interest.
Thanks, Monika, for a thought-provoking talk. Are there any questions also about understanding? Just add them, and there are already quite a few in the Q&A box, which are general questions for the debate. But maybe just checking if there's something coming in. I don't think so. So yeah, let me remind you before we go into the Q&A session that you can add at any time your questions in the Q&A box. You can also upvote questions by hitting the thumbs up button. Then it will go to the top of the list, and I will see them more quickly than if they are down the list. So feel free to do that. As I said, we already have few questions and already also some upvotes. So we will start. And may I ask the two experts to unmute and put the video on. Thanks so much. So first question goes to Monika. By scientists, as far as I know, yes, there are knowledge gaps in new technologies, but shouldn't they be compared to current technologies where knowledge gaps may be even greater, e.g. CRISPR-Cas9 versus mutagenesis? So mutagenesis, I guess, refers to all the technologies which introduce mutants or mutations in organisms which are much more, how shall I say, harsher in scope, so they introduce mutations wherever you see in the genome, versus CRISPR-Cas you can be much more specific. So yeah, should one do this balance?
Well, that's a very good question. And as I said at the outset, I'm not a scientist, so I couldn't say anything informative about how mutagenesis compares exactly to CRISPR, even apart from the fact that CRISPR is more precise. I couldn't say anything informative about the harms involved in comparing these two technologies. But it is certainly right, if both technologies, if we have indications that both technologies produce harms, and we don't have enough knowledge about how likely that harm is, in principle, the principle of precaution applies, unless we already have knowledge about the likelihood of these harms. Then we can then the principle doesn't apply anymore, and we simply weigh benefits and our chances and risks.
But as I understand this question, it means also that there are some technologies which may predate the introduction of the precautionary principle, or which have just been introduced. Even though they might have risks which we also might not be able to judge completely, yet they are in use, and there are new ones coming where we have more open questions, but they might be much better. So how do we deal with this question?
Yeah, I mean, I had one slide where I said we shouldn't use the principle arbitrarily, right? Or that's true. And but the fact that we haven't used the principle of precaution, even we should have used it, doesn't permit us to not use it now if substantial harms might be occurring. We might have made a mistake in the past, but that doesn't give us license to make the same mistake now, if that's the case. If it's true that we made a mistake and that the principle should have applied in the past in assessing that particular technology, then we made a mistake. That's true, and it should have applied, but we can't infer from that mistake that we're now licensed to make it again.
I think the question actually refers to probably the case that saying, if we replace mutagenesis by CRISPR-Cas, we might be better off. So.
Well, that's a very tricky question, and I feel like I understand why I don't feel qualified to fully answer it, and maybe Harald König can say something on this, is that I'm unable to assess the harms involved and the precise knowledge gap involved in these two technologies. And that's why ethicists and scientists always have to work together in assessing them, right? Because that's not something we can do. And how likely and if it's really true that CRISPR is less harmful, or the likelihood of serious and irreversible harm is lower than in the case of mutagenesis, that's something that needs to be very, very carefully assessed. And I kind of doubt that this is really possible. So I think we're back to the previous topic that, we can't infer from previous mistakes to make new ones. Even if it might be a little bit less likely, but since it's hard to assess, or maybe impossible to assess, we don't really have a license to go for it, I think. But concerning the exact probabilities, that's something I can't really judge. I have to admit that. And I mean, I never claimed I would be able to judge that.
So you mentioned there might be a cooperation with science here. So Harald, what's your take on this one?
Yeah, well, if you compare those two technologies, like classical mutagenesis by chemicals or radiation and CRISPR-Cas, I think most scientists at the moment would agree that we would be at least not worse off if we would use CRISPR for certain applications. So doing those small changes which you cannot distinguish from mutations that would also naturally occur At least there are no hints that you would get more off-targets effect or more mutations than you do with a classical radiation or chemical approach. So, but I think at the end, of course, the question is what, at least if you compare those two technologies, I think there, as I said there, I would think when one could compare by the methods we have, that we would at least not be worse off. Of course, the question is whether both technologies are in view of scientists or other stakeholders, whether we are precautionary enough already. And I think this is one question we haven't discussed it. How precautionary should we be? What can we ever know? And this is what I try to make clear in my talk, that this always depends on what is at stake for different people, how they judge this, what are their views on natural, on risk, how they perceive risks, and so this will always be, of course, a political decision at the end.
If I understood this correctly, Monika, the ethics committee is composed of different people from different walks of life or different walks of profession. So do you arrive at all sometimes at uniform decision, or do you always have representations of these different views, or do you sometimes come to a point where people kind of agree?
I think, yeah, usually, I mean, what we do is we don't pretend to always be in consensus. So when we write our reports, we always mention what the majority view is, or if there's no majority view, we just state how many people vote for what. So we usually take a vote on many of these issues. But there are also cases where we, by and large, converge. I mean, there might be always one person who's the odd man or woman out, but it's interesting that in there are cases where we converge. So it's not that there's no consensus at all, and it's a fascinating collaboration, which I really enjoy, because it's interesting to work on some issue together with other disciplines, which we usually don't do at universities, unless you're at the KIT. So we have a lawyer, we have a professor for law, we have like 2 scientists, we have 2 theologians, people from very different angles look at these things. I think by argument, you can reach some level of consensus. So I was curious to ask, actually, Harald, if I may use your first name, since we speak English, that's sort of more common. Sure. Because you said there is very little consensus possible. And I thought that was really interesting to hear, where you said people come from very different values and systems and worldviews, because I don't experience that so much in our committee. I wouldn't say we have, like, even though we have theologians and maybe atheists, I wouldn't say we come from like prefixed worldviews, which are set in stone, and that's why nobody's ready to give it up. But we sort of critically assess things and sort of converge more often than not. So is that a different situation because we all are already academics and kind of used to take a critical distance, or what? So I was curious to hear more about this.
Yes, I think this has to do with this, because in this project, which I refer to, this was a large international project which involved all different kinds of stakeholders from all different walks of life, from left and ecologically critical civil society organization, like for instance ETC group or Friends of the Earth, up to industry player who are involved in this, or people from social sciences, from technology assessment, also different general public, so to speak. So yeah, I think this has to do with those. What you are probably doing is a sort of interdisciplinary kind of analysis in your committee, and this is what I referred before to what is more in a sort of transdisciplinary approach, where also many actors, non-scientific actors, non-academic actors are involved, which, and I think there is what Paul Feyerabend once called, those people have different realities, in the sense that really is what is basic to them, what is existential to them, to people, to nations, and I think those things play in there, and which can generate really deep divides. And as I exemplified, which are even due to not only different worldviews but competing worldviews in some cases, and those deep value differences or divides in worldviews, they are really very, very difficult to overcome, and maybe this is only possible by some sort of meta consensus in a normative way. So I think this is the difference.
Interesting. So let's go back to the Q&A box. There are 7 questions there now. So this is a question to both of you. What is your opinion on the study of the European Commission on new genomic techniques and the proposal to take in the future also possible benefits into account and not only assess risks? I think there were some points in your talk, Monika, which refer to this. So maybe you can go first.
I think I would let Harald König go first if he likes to.
Fine with me.
I mean, in my view, I looked at this report, and there are a couple of suggestions, and which are also somehow ambiguous. For instance, another suggestion is that not only scientific data should go in there, but also, as I explained a little bit, also there should be socioeconomic. A socioeconomic effect should flow in, also with respect to the precautionary principle, which would be when I understood this correctly, this would be a sort of move from, at least at the EU level, from using the precautionary principle based on science and lack on scientific knowledge to also involve socioeconomic issues, like it is, for instance, on the level of the United Nations in the Cartagena Protocol of biosafety, for instance, where this is explicitly mentioned at all. So the benefits, yeah, they should go in there also. I think this is has to go somehow. Also, I understand what Monika explained, that maybe you cannot judge benefits versus harms if you cannot really know exactly what harms can happen. So that this, and maybe also not what are the benefits at the end. So this will be certainly different. But for me, the most interesting move, as I said, was that the shift from precautionary approach based on science, or should be mainly based on science, now to that socio-economic issues should roll there as well, if I understood this correctly.
Yeah, if I may add, we also thought that, I mean, economic effects shouldn't play any role when we assess, the harmfulness of one potential technology, right? First of all, we should consider what the likelihood of harm is to our citizens or to the world at large, and that's independent of what money people can make out of this technology. And we cannot weigh the one against the other, especially not if it's a situation where the principle of precaution applies. That's why we actually wrote this second working paper with some ethical deliberations on the so-called principle of innovation, because people sometimes think the precautionary principle kills innovation. And we don't think this holds true, and we're not against innovation, but many people hide behind this principle of innovation economic interests. And of course, that's not our interest to favor industry to make money out of these technologies. I mean, that's good if these technologies qualify as safe enough. But if not, if you're still unsure how big the harm will be and how likely it will be, we should be more cautious than that. And then we're unable to weigh risks against our chances against risks.
But if you say you shouldn't, put industry benefit in front of possible harm. I mean, I think sometimes it happens also that people are talking about risks, which by all intentions, if you take it scientifically, they're not really, it seems that they're really, really, really far-fetched and maybe even invented or whatever. So how does this, is taken into account?
I mean, that might very well happen. But then we're talking about a very bad risk assessment. That's about, empirical issues. How do we estimate probabilities? That's darn hard in these cases, right? Because the complexity is tremendous. And we have to admit to that. And, we need statisticians and what have you to assess these risks properly, if that's possible, or admit we can't assess them. And if we can't, but, serious harm because it's irreversible, et cetera, might occur. All we say is then we have to be cautious. And then the argument doesn't apply that somebody could make tremendous profit out of this, right? Because if the likelihood can't be assessed, but there might be serious harm occurring, we can't be weighing that against potential profit. Yeah, because our negative duty to to avoid harm is greater than any potential benefits. Especially because these benefits are not to humankind, but to individual stakeholders, as Harald called them, and that's business language, stakeholder, to call people, to speak of stakeholders. And I'm not against business, and I'm not against innovation, and none of us is, but that's not the only criterion by which we evaluate policies and technologies.
But benefits could also be, I mean, there
could be other benefits.
There could be benefit to a company, but then it could be also benefit to I don't know, farmers, because it is really a better technology. I'm talking now about not a specific case, but
that's again
something.
Yeah,
and so there are different modes of benefits.
True, sure. And but if you say benefits to farmers, it sounds again economic, but fair enough. The only point I guess we're trying to make is if the harms are to some extent likely, but we don't know how likely and how serious and how irreversible these things will be, we have to be cautious. That's all I'm saying. And that means we can't really weigh them against benefits. We could also say it's a benefit to science. It's great for scientists to see that implemented to make further research. And, given that I work at a university, I even have some empathy and understanding for this. Of course, we want to see our inventions sort of unfold. But if you look at it from a societal perspective, and if you think about what does this do to humankind, right? You have to think hard how to assess these risks, and if we can't assess them, what to do with that. And you're totally right, we might make many mistakes in assessing them. And I'm not the right person to talk to if you want to know how to better assess them. And we certainly have to collaborate on this to do this properly and ideally without bias for our own fields, right? We shouldn't be business persons right from the start. We should put ourselves, as John Rawls called it, behind a veil of ignorance, disregarding whether I'm a scientist or a business person or whatever, and think from an impartial standpoint, what does this do to us as a society or even as a world community if we implement this? What could happen to our ecosystem and how can we assess this? That's the perspective and that's the question. And but I agree, it might be very, very difficult or impossible to assess these risks. And then do we want to bear them? Right? And I guess the principle says well, maybe we should wait and see and gather more information before we implement them. You know, that's all. And I would need to see arguments that say, well, no, we don't want to wait and see and gather more information.
Harald, you were...
Yeah, I mean, I completely understand this and agree to a large extent, but still I think in de facto or in reality, I think benefits will always weigh against risks in practice, at least by users, for instance, or by different... You don't like the term stakeholders, or,
no,
let's say affected people.
Totally
this could also be citizens. For instance, just one example from reproductive technologies. If you think of introduction of this in vitro fertilization technique, ICSI, intracytoplasmic sperm injection, which I mean, this is generally true for those reproductive technologies, and people first use this, and then it's actually people who want to have children and can't have for other reasons, and then they do a very personal weighing of risks and benefits. And if you think of ICSI, for instance, the first couples who did this, they did this because they tried 13 years to get a child, and then they did it. Also, there were just experiments on animals available, and they were rather ambiguous even. For instance, experiments with rabbits, with cows, and they were not also great. And they nevertheless, they decided to do it. And this is just to say that in practice, in reality, this will be done by people, because benefits and risks is, even if you can't assess it scientifically, I think benefits and risk is something people perceive dependent on their situation. So one cannot just not prevent this, that risks and benefits are weighed against each other. Whether it's on the level of different people or on the level of politics, of course, as well.
That ties in to one question that came in the very beginning already, and it asks in a way that thing in saying that, you know, CRISPR-Cas, you might be able to control it in the university environment by you know, clamping down on research which is not allowed, which is not so difficult on the universities. But then it says, you know, but whoever tycoon with lots of money can hire scientists and have a lab and then, you know, put it out, as has happened actually with these CRISPR babies, not a tycoon, but this guy in China. So how then, you know, can you kind of put this regulation in practice so this doesn't happen? I mean, it's maybe kind of, you're not the enforcement arms, but you might have some thoughts. Whoever wants to go first.
Yeah, but you just mentioned this case of this Chinese researcher who apparently generated genetically modified children there, and I think there the issue was that there were no, I mean, basically there seemed to be a sort of scientific consensus that things like this should not be done before we know more. This is true, but then this all was done. So there was a sort of scientific self-regulation, if you wish, but this was apparently not strong enough, or just illusionary, because people in secret, that of course you can do this and this was done mostly secrecy, and whether this was done without any knowledge of state actors, I think this is questionable, because the commission who investigated this was a Chinese commission. It's not clear who was in the commission, what was the result of these things. So it could also just be that they know it and they backed it, and if this had worked, this would have been the hero. Now he is the guy who went to prison, and maybe they just let fall. This is just speculation, but one has to be careful there, because not that much known is about the backgrounds. They are clear is that key ethical principles were were not obeyed, like informed consent, and things like this all was done in secrecy, so things could not be judged. And I think the way to go is to try to establish rules, guidelines, which people who want to do this, they can follow and do this in a sort of under certain precautionary principles then, and that they not just do it like they think this should be done. And I think at the moment this is not a case yet that we know how this can be done or not enough, and therefore I think there's a sort of consensus that this should not be done. But of course, every country could handle this differently. If they come to the conclusion, now we know enough, we can do it, they could, of course, at least legally, they could do this. I think there's no way to get a global consensus on this, because the societies and the moral stances in different countries on reproductive technologies or things like this, they are very much different.
So the question with the most votes now is, if no action is taken because of uncertainties, the outcome could be even more harmful sometimes. Not to act is not always the better thing than being passive because of precaution. One example mentioned here in this question is mRNA vaccine development, which we all know are glad right now, or I would say most people. So what does ethics say against this? I mean, that I think it's kind of ties in what we have discussed already a little bit.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure whether this mistakes again a cost-benefit analysis, as if that was possible. And, you know, the principle of precaution does not apply to such cases where we can actually weigh the costs and benefits. If we can, we weigh them, right? And then we have various ethical theories that might yield different results, but still we would talk about what the benefits are and what the, you know, the harms are. And the principle of, that's not a case where the principle of precaution even applies. And ideally, it only applies to cases where we don't know exactly what the harms and benefits are and how they weigh and what the likelihood is of them occurring. You know, in hindsight, of course, sometimes things look differently. That's maybe is a further complication. Like, as of now, we might not have enough knowledge and we don't know about the likelihoods and harms, etc. And then we gather more information, and maybe in 10 years from now, things look very differently. And in 10 years, we might say, well, we could have started earlier, because from now we see it's actually not that harmful. But that's not really an argument that applies for us now, because now we don't know.
But what I think is in a way what I see is that it's kind of maybe for not specialists difficult in real life to see when the precautionary principle applies and when not, because in theory, in your talk, it was pretty clear. But then if you take this example, for example, but others, then it's not so clear.
Yeah, okay. But that's a problem of application of the principle and about likelihoods and whether we can assess them or not. So, and that's actually not our genuine business, if you like, which doesn't mean I want to evade the question, but like that's what scientists need to, or we all need to do together to assess, you know, how grave the knowledge gaps are and how little we can say about particular likelihoods of harms occurring. That's something we have to take from others and then say, well, if we can't assess it, then we should be precautious. But if we can assess it, you know, then the principle doesn't apply. Then we can weigh costs and benefits and talk about this, right? How much risks we would be willing to accept for certain benefits, etc., etc. Then we can do calculations. The principle applies when we can't do calculations, at least in theory, right? And we're only talking about theory. And it becomes it becomes rough and dirty when we try to apply this theory to practice. I fully agree, but that's not a downside, if you like, of the theory. That's just how it is when we apply ideas to practice. And then we need to know, well, is it likely? Is it not likely? Can we assess the likelihood or can we not? And that's something I could not, I don't know, right? If somebody tells me, well, CRISPR is actually not that harmful and the likelihoods are easily handleable, which I don't believe, but maybe if somebody tells me that plausibly and has arguments for this, then I would be very willing to agree, okay, so this is not the case for the principle of precaution. And I also agree that there might be, to come back to our König's words, there might be no consensus about how to assess the likelihoods. Maybe that's the case. I doubt it with respect to CRISPR, but even if there's no consensus, well, then the question is, what do we do then?
But at which stage, I mean, do you apply it? I'm thinking about, let's say you have like a technology for agriculture, and there are big discussions if you can do experiments on a very well protected field. Many people are against this, and so is this. But then you could say really this field is really protected, and you can show that it might be a risky technique, but you have all the precautions that they can't escape.
Then it's fine.
That's fine. You can do that.
Yeah, but
okay.
I guess in the case of CRISPR, that's not so easy, right? You know, if it doesn't stay within physical barriers, then you can do experiments on protected fields, but having protected fields is one way to gather more information and be precautious.
Right, okay, but then these field experiments, they are okay under the precautionary principle?
If they are, because that's one way of having some kind of moratorium and wait and see and seek more information about likelihoods of harms without actually implementing it for full. So the principle doesn't rule out that we gather more information, right?
Okay.
In protected sites and whatever is possible and is not risky, then that is possible.
Okay, so the next question is rather long. I hope I can read all this. So would a reasonable interpretation of the principle of precaution comprise a regular review of the state of knowledge as it evolves, and a regular re-evaluation of decisions taken at a time when information was less complete? The GMO case, where many of our present very restrictive framework conditions were introduced many years ago with reference to the precautionary principle, clearly shows that this does not work in practice. Meaning, as I understand it, this person is saying GMOs are much safer than people thought in the beginning. So now the regulatory approach should be changed. Yeah, it says despite the decades of accumulated scientific biosafety data. So I mean, do you see that there should be such a re-evaluation of things? I guess it says the question goes to you, but I think that's also really one for Harald as well.
Please go for it.
Yeah, I think the first thing is that there are still controversies between people from different backgrounds, even among scientists. If you compare, for instance, people coming from the ecological field to hardcore molecular biologists, I think there is no consensus that we know already enough that for instance also classical GMOs are safe. That is what they say, and so therefore it depends on whom you ask whether we should basically revise this regulation. For me, already the fact that this regulation was emerged 30 years ago would be reason enough to revise it. And as I stated in my last slide, this would be one of the the principles of this governance things, that things are revised in a sort of regular manner, and 30 years is maybe much too late already. And let me come back to this EU paper from the EU Commission. Another point which came into my mind, which they made, is also that for instance, those CRISPR mutation or target mutation by CRISPR should not be assessed differently from the classical mutation. This was also something which was stated in this paper. This could be a hint that regulation is now under revision, or that people would like to revise it also. So yes, I would think, I mean, I cannot solve this conflict between those different scientists and let alone different stakeholders. If you bring in environmental NGOs, they see this completely different, as I said before, because what those scientific data actually say, or how they are interpreted, there again, this completely differs between scientists, even belong different disciplines, and then also between different stakeholders, how they interpret this, whether this says it would be safe enough or safer than before, and so on and so forth. So this would be difficult to solve. I mean, this is a political issue then at the end, but as I said, for me, it would already, the time would say this had to be revised. Now at least a really severe discussion has to start now, given also the CRISPR things which emerge now.
Monika?
Yeah, I fully agree, I think. And the principle of precaution doesn't rule that out. On the contrary, it might call for a moratorium, which implies that we gather further information and then revise our decision, potentially given the information we then acquire, which might then show that it's, you know, the likelihoods are such that we can go ahead or not. And so I think actually that things are up for revision is not only important in technology, in assessing technologies, it's important in any field, but particularly in this fast-moving field of biotechnology. I agree 30 years is far too long, and things are not set in stone forever. And you know, we collect new data and new information. So that's reason enough to do that every 5 years, or I don't know, to set something like that, and so that things reopen. So that might make it also easier to go for precaution if we say there is a certain amount of years and then we re-evaluate given further information that we then acquired. Because I find this fascinating what Harald said, that who has much more experience than I do when it comes to policy making, that, you know, you do not even get scientists to agree. So if we have so much disagreements in terms of the assessment of risks, we can still question ourselves and ask, well, what would then, given our disagreements, is it reasonable to go for the risky thing, or is it reasonable to not, you know, to hope for the benefits occurring? What's a reasonable, acceptable risk policy in cases where we disagree about what the risks are? And I guess in these cases, the principle of precaution is a bit more on the conservative side, because, and I think there is some plausibility that if, you know, grave harm can occur, we should, at least for some time, maybe for 5 years, prevent it from happening and hope to find more information about it than just go for it and then have grave risks possibly occurring. That seems to me plausible, but maybe I'm an exception. I don't know, because eventually, you know, that's. I mean, these are very tricky issues, that's for sure. But it strikes me as reasonable, I must say. And
sure, maybe a short intervention, because we still have quite a few questions and not so much time left. Do you want, Harald?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
You can go for other questions, I guess.
Okay, so there is one interesting question related to CRISPR-Cas and the precautionary principle. And it asks, how specifically is this principle applied to particular technologies? Because CRISPR-Cas has many various applications that might also have very different risk and uncertainty profiles. So how is it linked to specific applications or to the technology as a whole?
That's a very good question. So far, we sort of evaluated the technology as a whole, if one can say that much. But I would find it interesting to hear more about the possibility of applying this technology with fewer risks to specific areas or not, and if that's possible to parse this. Then the principle might yield different conclusions for different areas of application. That's something I couldn't say off the top of my head, not knowing enough myself about the technology. So maybe Harald has a view on this, whether that's possible at all to say here, to use it for this area, it's no problem, but it might be a problem for other areas, whether one can do that.
Yeah, I think this is also the idea of this case-by-case approach of evaluating applications of technologies. And I think as a concrete example then with CRISPR again would be that I think these are also what people think currently, also not also in Europe, I think also globally. I think this could be the trend that certain application of CRISPR where you only do small changes in the genome, which could also happen naturally by other mutagenesis techniques, that they will be regulated differently and probably also depend on which traits you bring in, similar to, for instance, the regulation in Canada, which is actually based on whether you bring in a really new trait rather than as it is in Europe, where the technological approach per se triggers the regulation. So I think specifically to the regulatory implications, I think yes, there should be a differentiation, even within one application in CRISPR. If we think now on GM, on genetically modified crops, where you can do different things with CRISPR, from small changes to multiplexing and changing a lot of genes at the same time, which could have completely different different implications than the things I mentioned before. Yes, and then of course there are other applications. If you think of gene drives, where you have the additional dimension that the thing can maybe not confined within even a single country or doesn't care about borders, and so you have to solve somehow this on the international level. These are another dimension. So if you compare somatic gene therapy, which we heard about in the last seminars, if you would compare this to, for instance, a germline therapy, then there are of course also completely different risks, because this is transferred to the next generations. You don't know what happens if different variants then come together in the next generation and things like this. So yes, of course, I think this would be absolutely necessary then to look case by case or application by application.
To not apply it generally or in a generalized way, but in a particular way. I mean, that would be fine by the principle if it is possible, and if there is no spread from one area to the other, then this might be very well licensed.
I think it could, what precaution means could then be, or what the precautionary measures are, they could be quite different then.
Yeah.
As you said, they should be proportional, and what this means would certainly be different for different applications, I would think.
Depending on the risks and what we know about them.
Exactly.
And that might be different in different areas. And if that is the case, it would be even, it might be a more fine-grained approach to apply it differently in different areas. And and that's fine.
Okay, thanks. I think one last question that we can fit in with questions of a bit short answers, so we can make it to the deadline. This question, it says risk means uncertainty. Uncertainty means high variability, and people are less or more averse against risks. So how does a group of experts define the limits of risks? It's kind of, I guess, yeah, looking at this question, how you kind of define who in the end has a say what risk is acceptable in a way.
Yeah, if I could start, I think this boils down then to the kind of decisions which are made then and who makes those decisions. And I think if you have those inclusive participatory approaches, you would get different answers to this, what is acceptable as risk. As I try to explain by this example and reproductive technologies before, this might be quite different depending on the different situation of the people, how they judge benefits and risks. And I think one should not make one mistake that the risks which are defined in an expert round might be the same risks that people which are not experts in those fields would agree on.
Now, maybe I just want to add again that the principle of precaution applies in cases where we actually don't know what the precise risks are. And maybe even in cases where there's huge disagreement about what the risks are. So it applies in cases where we are uncertain about what the risks are, where we can't really weigh risks against chances.
But isn't this also not always the same? I mean, it just came up in my mind that let's say you'd have a technology that is applied in agriculture. In a way, the whole Earth is at risk, might be at risk. But if you have a technology, as Harald has mentioned, helping some people get a child, and now excluding a technology which changes the genome in the later generation, but just helping these people to get a child, that's a much smaller population at risk, if you like. And also there you can say society is in a way deciding about the fate of this group of people. So aren't these two very much different areas, and the approach should be different in how you take the decision if you can go forward with this technique or not?
Yeah, I think they are different. I think if you think of gene drives, comes as no surprise that this is a contentious issue and at all an issue at the level of the United Nations, the Cartagena Protocol of Biosafety and so on and so forth. So this can probably only solved globally. Whereas those reproductive technologies, there's certainly not, also now with, apart from, as you said, with maybe the germline modification things, some people think this should be also a global thing, but I think this is a complete illusion. There will be never a global consensus on this, and there should also not be, because, as I said, the moral stances, religious things, and whatever plays into there, they are just different on Earth. So this in my view will not be a global thing. And as you said, the normal reproductive technologies, they are also not a global thing. I mean, every country has its rules, and every society deals with this. So yeah, this also depends, I think, on the, as you said, on the applications, definitely.
Monika, some thoughts on this?
I think I agree. And given that we're running out of time, I think that'll be it from my side for the moment.
Okay, so thank you so much to all of you, for a lively Q&A session and excellent questions and excellent answers and discussions. This was the last webinar of this series about the CRISPR technology. It was organized by the Forum for Genetic Research from the Swiss Academy of Sciences and co-sponsored by the Federal Office for the Environment. Please visit the Q&A box now to find the links to this webinar and a short poll asking for feedback concerning today's webinar. Thanks again to our speakers and yeah, for their insights, and to you all for your interest and the excellent questions. Goodbye.
Thank you.